Recording in progress.
Is that good enough? Is that good enough? Good enough? Good enough? Okay. Well, it's still playing out of the computer. There is that problem. Okay.
You had a video, it changes a lot.
Yeah. That's fine.
Thank you for your patience.
It's beautiful. Is that going to work? Yeah, you are.
Testing. All right.
All right. Okay. Better. All right. So we'll go ahead and start the way we began the morning. Just take time to slow down, ground ourselves in our breath, being present and centered in the here and now. Let us breathe in the love of God. Let us breathe in the grace of God. Let us breathe in the peace of God. With each breath, we recognize that we participate in an ecological miracle, a miracle that sustains our lives and connects us directly to the creation and to the Creator. Well, good evening. It's good, of course, to see you all. Again, it's an honor to be with you all. I am so grateful for this group, grateful for the hearts and minds that are here, the talents, the gifts. It's just amazing and remarkable. For those who are new online, my name is Reverend Andrew Black. I'm a pastor at First Presbyterian Church, the founder of Earthkeepers 360, and the director of Land and Rivers at the National Wildlife Federation. As the director of Land and Rivers at NWF, I have the honor, of course, of working a lot with our tribal partnerships team and being a part of that team. And in this work, I get to, and so there's the Tribal and Indigenous Partnerships Enhancement Strategy is kind of our overarching work. But in this work, I really get to provide support and capacity to a diverse array of tribes and indigenous communities all over the nation as we work together to protect sacred landscapes and waters, work on environmental justice issues, food sovereignty issues. And here you see some of the goals of the Tribal Partnerships team. Obviously, supporting Indigenous partners in their pursuit of equitable resources, access to decision-making process, and achievement of policy priorities through coordinated advocacy. And then you see kind of the bigger conservation goals, and particularly around environmental justice and kind of protection of lands. And then the relationships with these communities is obviously important. You move at the speed of trust, and that takes time, right? And it takes the ability. I always say that people, you know, as one who works in a lot of community organizing, that's most of my background, that before people care about what you know, they need to know that you care. And they need to know that you're with them and that you're there to listen. Those are good spiritual direction principles, right? A chance to just kind of slow down and to be in community, to break bread together, to understand what their values are, how to listen, how to build trust, and to kind of work at that pace. And with that said, you know, obviously one of the big issues we work around is free, prior, and informed consent. Many of you probably heard the term FPIC. Which deals with a whole lot of different things. But in this work, free, prior, and informed consent is really a principle that's long rooted in indigenous traditions and international human rights. And it basically affirms indigenous people's right to give or withhold consent on projects, laws, or policies that affect land, resources, or communities. FPIC is really about ensuring indigenous communities aren't just consulted, right? We're going to tell you what we're going to do to your land, but really actually having decision-making in the power and authority structures about what happens to the land, what happens to the water, what other happens to their community, to their resources. And it's obviously a key safeguard of democracy. It's also one of the things that is probably the most under attack right now, as well as self-determination. And so when it comes to mining, forestry, oil and gas, wildlife, these are really critical principles that people, you know, need to understand and kind of why they're core to the work we do. And this was a really good slide. So we actually at National Wildlife Federation, we have one of my colleagues, John Naranjo, is the FPIC manager. That's a really unique position if you think about it for an environmental organization to have an FPIC manager. But this talks about free of coercion, manipulation, or externally imposed timelines prior to initial stages of planning. You know, we're going to tell you about this decision that we already did a couple months ago and let you know that's sometimes how consultation is, right? And so it's trying to change that. Informing people of the facts and information of proposed actions in an accessible format. We're going to give you such a convoluted, complex scientific chart that you're not going to know what we're really telling you we're going to do to your land, to your water, to your wildlife. And so this is accessible format is really critical. And then obviously consent is dealing with the community on their own terms. and talking to them and building that sense of trust. And all of those things are obviously under a huge amount of jeopardy right now, but they're really important for us to kind of come back to. And you saw that kind of challenge in the Arctic. Some of you are probably going to start reading a lot more stories about Ambler Road and what's going on with that mining road that's going to be put right through the middle of the top of that area. And it's going to be all over the news, but this is a huge challenge to these very principles right here, of course. So as you saw from the original title slide, the topic we'll be discussing tonight is the theology, spirituality, and public policies of wildlife. We're going to be looking at some of the biblical text informing this theology, but also some of the difficult truths about what's happening with the world's wildlife crisis and how we must have faithful imagination and prophetic action to solve this crisis. So with that said, let's begin. What do you all notice about this picture? What do you notice about the humanity, the wildlife, God? What do you see in that picture? That's a great point. So much more wildlife than humanity in that picture. Peaceable kingdom. There you go. Yeah. 2x2s. Yeah, we'll get to it. You're catching on it for sure. Yeah, the wildlife is, is in pairs. There's plentiful and an abundance. And then that sense of obviously the rainbow, the covenant, and we all know what this story is depicting, the story of Noah's Ark that many of us probably have not read since we were 5, 6 years old in Sunday school. But I'm going to call up Shannon now, and she's going to, provide us this text tonight. This is a really important and critical text. And I think it's one we need to come back to as congregations. It's one we need to come back to as adults and really listen to the meticulousness of it. Really listen to what it's saying about the state of the world, about God, about humanity, and about wildlife. Thank you, Sheila.
Mic's on, right?
Yep.
So we start in Genesis 6:5, and we're going to go all the way over to 7:5. So 5 to 5. The Lord saw that the wickedness of humankind was great in the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of their heart was only evil continually. And the Lord was sorry that he had made humankind on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. So the Lord said, I will blot out from the earth the human beings I have created, people together with animals and creeping things and birds of the air, for I am sorry that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the sight of the Lord. These are the descendants of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God. And Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. And God saw that the earth was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted its ways upon the earth. And God said to Noah, I have determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. Now I am going to destroy them along with the earth. Make yourself an ark of cypress wood, make rooms in the ark, and cover it inside and out with pitch. This is how you are to make it. The length of the ark, 300 cubits, its width, 50 cubits, its height, 30 cubits. Make a roof for the ark and finish it to a cubit above, and put the door of the ark in its side. Make it with lower, second, and third decks. For my part, I am going to bring a flood of waters on the earth to destroy from under heaven all flesh in which is the breath of life. Everything that is on the earth shall die. But I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall come into the ark, you, your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives with you. And of every living thing, of all flesh, you shall bring 2 of every kind into the ark to keep them alive with you. They shall be male and female. Of the birds according to their kinds, and of the animals according to their kinds, of every creeping thing of the ground according to its kind, 2 of every kind shall also come to you to keep them alive. Also take with you every kind of food that is eaten and store it up, and it shall serve as food for you and for them. Noah did this. He did all that God commanded him. Then the Lord said to Noah, "Go into the ark, you and all your household, for I have seen all that you alone are righteous before me in this generation. Take with you 7 pairs of all clean animals, the male and its mate, and a pair of the animals that are not clean, the male and its mate, and 7 pairs of all the birds of the air, also male and female, to keep their kind alive on the face of all the earth. For in 7 days I will send rain on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights, and every living thing that I have made I will blot out from the face of the ground." And Noah did all that the Lord had commanded to him.
What do you all think of that text? Yeah. Yeah, the state of the earth is not good. There's a situation going on. The world is filled with wickedness, it says. Hearts are filled with evil continually. The Lord was sorry to have made humankind. Genesis 6:11 goes on to say the earth was corrupt, filled with violence and lawlessness. I like to just tell my congregation, I think God has a little buyer's remorse here. Yeah. Tell me a little bit about the protection of the animals, though. What do you see going on there? Brought more animals than humans. No. Yeah. Yeah. Well, you're picking up on a key theme, and we'll get into this, Professor Toll, about the prophets noticing what human beings have serious consequences and what the humans do have serious consequences for creation for the animals, right? The animals lay in this situation blameless, but humanity is bringing suffering and pain to the animals and to the wildlife kingdom. It's interesting that in the face of human corruption, lawlessness, human-caused environmental degradation, Noah is charged with a duty, though. He's charged with the duty of protecting every land species and bird of the air, and I quote, to keep their kind alive on the face of the earth. In Genesis 7:3. I think that is such an important line. To keep their kind alive on the face of all the earth. In fact, you obviously heard detailed and meticulous instructions that are given to Noah to ensure that all species are safe, that they're cared for, and that the species are able to procreate, as Genesis 7:2-3 talk about. This is very different than what's happening in our current political climate. Noah does not get to choose which animals to protect and preserve, but must follow the divine order to protect all species, even those animals considered quote unquote unclean. Genesis 7:2. It becomes clear that we follow a God that deeply and painstakingly cares about the genetic viability and survival of God's species that God created. This story goes far beyond a simple Sunday school lesson. This story highlights an important biblical ethic where God cares deeply about the long-term well-being of God's creatures when faced with a world of lawlessness, corruption, exploitation, and environmental degradation. The overarching message of the story is that, like Noah, we too have a sacred duty and a responsibility to ensure the long-term care, safety, health, and viability of each and every species. In essence, as we read this story, we may actually be reading the very first story of the first conservationists. However, the real danger that the story of Noah warns against is one of hubris. Hubris where we think we can play God by choosing and judging which species live and which ones die. The story obviously leaves us as the readers with lots of complex questions. But one of the principal questions of the story is if God chooses to painstakingly and with great detail protect every species, then why don't we? Digging a little deeper into this ethic, the book of Job reminds us that we must listen to the animals and to seek understanding for what the wildlife are saying to us. And better yet, understand how to live in tune with God's rhythms and creation. I love this text out of Job, but ask the animals, they will teach you. The birds of the air, and they will tell you. Ask the plants of the earth, and they will teach you, and the fish of the sea will declare to you. Who among all these does not know that the hand of the Lord had done this? In God's hand is the life of every living thing and the breath of every human being. How often have you ever heard these texts preached and taught on in the church? Why not? Do we not know what to do with them? Have we lost our connection with the animals? How were we originally connected to the animals? How were they our teachers? There are still many communities in our nation and in our world that understand this. One of these communities, and speaking to this wisdom, is one of my best friends, Joseph Brophy Toledo. He's a traditional leader and medicine man at Jemez Pueblo in northern New Mexico, or Walatoa. Brophy is an earthkeeper, spiritual advisor. He's the godfather to my daughter. And frankly, he's just an incredible human being that does amazing and transformative work with land, water, and wildlife, but also teaching the youth of the Pueblos and indigenous communities about these deeper values. Would somebody mind reading Brophy's words? Yeah, if you want to come up, yeah, you can come up to the mic. It'd be good. I think these words are so important and teach us where we have come from and maybe what we've lost.
All earth people are born naked. We enter the world naked. We saw what the animals were wearing, what keeps the animals warm, how the animals took shelter, where they moved, and what they ate. We had to learn from the animals to survive, where the water was, how the plants could help us, and how to understand our medicines. We hold prayers and dances to honor the animals who are our teachers. Without the animals, none of us would be standing here in the present day. Animals don't have a voice in our political world, and they know no borders. We must speak for the four-legged, winged, finned, pollinators, and microinvertebrates. Animals keep the world in harmony. As earth people, we have a duty to be their voice. We have to take care of them. We have to be the earth keepers.
Obviously, there's much more at stake than just animals and species survival. It's about culture, wisdom, understanding, long lessons within these traditions and communities that speak to one's identity and understanding of one's role on the earth. So now let's see what the animals are teaching us, what the animals are saying and trying to speak to us and telling us. Right now, there's 1 million animal and plant species that are facing extinction. Nature is declining globally at rates that are unprecedented in human history. We're facing extinction rates of 10 to 100 times higher than average. This data was compiled by 145 experts from 50 countries over 3 years and includes 15,000 original sources. It is hands down the most comprehensive wildlife analysis that the world has ever done. And this report says, and I quote, and this is really critical for this group. This report says, the current global response is insufficient, and we need transformative changes to restore and protect nature. Opposition from vested interests can be overcome for the public good. Here you see the definition of an indicator and a keystone species. An indicator species is the barometer of the overall ecosystem. It's like the proverbial canary in the cave. If the indicator species are struggling, then it may highlight greater ecosystems in distress. Whereas a keystone species is a species that has disproportionately large effects on their ecosystem. Without them, the ecosystem can collapse or drastically will change. For example, beavers that create whole wetlands, or apex predators like wolves in Yellowstone that eat ungulates that then allow for other animals to thrive because the grasslands are more healthy. Matt, you were talking about sea urchins and what happens with the kelp beds. Yep. Obviously, otters and things like that help with the urchins. And when you take out those kind of things, then you have other problems, right? Simply put, indicator species signal overall ecosystem health, while keystone species actively shape and maintain the ecosystems. Here you see global extinction rates for key animal species across the planet. I want you to notice that many of the animals that you see in trouble are either indicator or keystone species. For example, amphibians are an indicator species, and they are one of the most imperiled animals with over 40% threatened. If you notice this is I'll show you on this graph. So this is saying least concerned, near threatened, vulnerable, endangered, or critically endangered. And you can kind of see based on the range of what's going on with each of those different breakdowns globally. Here you see what it looks like in the United States. And you've got everything from freshwater snails up at the top and mussels and crayfish to amphibians right here in the middle to flowering plants, bees, conifers, mammals, and everything to birds. And you can kind of see presumed or possibly extinct is the blue, critically imperiled is the red, imperiled is the darker yellow, and then the lighter yellow is vulnerable. That's what's going on in our nation. As you can see, many of the indicator species in our country are in serious trouble, indicating that the ecosystems are in distress. This also shows extinction and presumed extinction. That's interesting. Scientists can't find any of these species, so they're presuming they're extinct. Hopefully they'll pop up, but it's not good. This slideshow shows you actual numbers from the breakdown in the wildlife in the United States, with over 150 species already have gone extinct, and more than 1,600 species are listed under the Endangered Species Act. 1/3 of all U.S. fish and wildlife are at risk of extinction. Friends, I don't use the term crisis mildly, but this is an ecological, theological, and existential crisis. Speaking to the spiritual consequences of this, Thomas Berry, we lose our souls if we lose the experience of the forests, the butterflies, the song of the birds, if we can't see the stars at night. What does that mean to you all when you hear a quote like that from Berry? What does that mean? Yeah. We were born naked. We enter this world naked. The animals taught us what to do. Right? Yep. Indeed. So what's causing this wildlife crisis? What's causing these extinction rates? What are the main drivers of what's happening? The major causes are listed here. The biggest one, obviously, of massive habitat and ecosystem loss, habitat degradation and overdevelopment. 75% of the Earth's land surface has been significantly altered. 66% of ocean areas experiencing increasing cumulative impacts. For chasing coral, is all about that. 85% of wetlands have been lost. Look at this. 80% of wildlife species in the American West rely on riparian habitats at some point in their lives. Connect the dots. 85% of wetlands have been lost. 80% of the wildlife in the West are relying on those very wetlands. 50% of live coral lost since 1870s. Habitat loss is a major, major issue, right? We know that. We know fragmentation. How many of you have ever heard the term habitat fragmentation? So essentially what that means is we're taking animals that live in a certain range of habitat, and that habitat is being
Recording something?
could be by development, it could be by fences, it could be by roads, right? And those animals are no longer able to reside in that area or cross through that area, and so they become basically alienated from their primary habitat. And so one of the big issues we see across the West in particular is animals are unable to get from their summer grounds to their winter grounds, or from their calving grounds or their breeding grounds, right? Because something has intersected it. This is not a new issue, but this is an issue that is now driving a lot of modern science. So for example, in the early 1900s, there was a conservationist named Ernest Thompson Seton. There's a Seton village in New Mexico. But he was writing an article as he was on the railroad, as it was crossing kind of between the US and Canada border. And he watched herds of pronghorn antelope running along the fence line of the railroad because they could not get from their wintering grounds to their summer grounds and vice versa. And they were dying off by the herd because we had not thought about animals crossing that rail line. We just wanted to put a fence onto it so the train wouldn't hit them. And of course, they were starving to death and they were running for hundreds of miles along this fence line of this railroad. And he writes about it extensively in the early 1900s. Between 1982 and 2001, 6,000 acres of wildlife habitat were lost daily to development in the United States. In the West, a football field worth of habitat is developed every 2.5 minutes. Towns across America, there are no caribou in Caribou, Maine. There's no buffalo in Buffalo, New York. And there's no rivers on River Road. Things are no better globally, where we're losing 100 acres of rainforest a minute and dozens of species are going extinct daily as a result of habitat loss, poaching, and climate change. Obviously, you can see those are other big drivers of these issues: pollution and pesticides, invasive species, and then we'll get to the big one, climate change, here in a second. Let's look at what climate is doing to species. One of the big issues, of course, with climate change is the speed in which it is happening. It is incredibly difficult for species to adapt and evolve, especially in the face of megafires, historic droughts in the West, floods, hurricanes, tornadoes, and extreme temperatures in other parts of the country. The toll is not just, of course, on wildlife species, but on a species known as the human species. Human beings, Homo sapiens. You see a chart here of natural disasters showing the rapid escalation of disasters over a 50-year period. Look at the jumps. 26 million people each year are thrust into poverty as a result of climate-related disasters. The amount of migration and displacement of human beings is in the millions and millions. And to be frank, if you care about social justice, you need to care about the environment. And if you care about the environment, you need to care about social justice. We live in such a compartmentalized and often bifurcated church and reality. Here's the Social Justice Committee, here's the Earth Care Committee, right? And you all go talk amongst yourselves and you have your passions. But we have to start working on the intersectionality. We have to work across those lines. We have to get those committees to build capacity and power together and organizing power, because these are not independent issues. They are impacting one another, and they are critical to what is happening in our world around migration, food issues, security, gender, violence, all kinds of things. One of the things that you, of course, see, and I hear a lot, is, well, isn't climate change just caused by overpopulation? There's a shade of truth to that. Certainly, there's a lot more humans on the planet. But it isn't just about having humans on the planet. It's about which humans, what's their lifestyles, and what is their impact on the planet's resources. I mean, the 50 least developed countries have contributed 1% of greenhouse gases causing climate change. The US, EU, and China have contributed 60%. The US is 4% of the world's population, but consumes a third of the world's natural resource. The US produces 25% of the world's greenhouse gases. And then, of course, the nations that are the least responsible are also the least resilient. Tony Arnold, who's a professor at University of Louisville, does amazing work as a law professor, and he's working on the Resilience Justice Project, which is exactly this. How does climate impact the least resilient communities? How do we help them be adaptive and resilient to what they are facing, and have the ability and the maneuverability to be like more affluent communities in the face of massive disasters? And this is some of the work that his projects are working on across the country and across the world. The thing that I love about God's word, it is so relevant and timely to our world today. Look at these two passages from the prophet. Hosea, there is no faithfulness or loyalty and no knowledge of God in the land. Swearing, lying, and murder, stealing and adultery break out. Bloodshed follows bloodshed. Therefore the land mourns, and all who live in it languish. Together with the wild animals and the birds of the air, even the fish of the sea are perishing. Look at the connectivity between one species to the other. The human species and what we are doing, and the impacts, of course, to the wildlife and to the land. Sound familiar to the world we have today? Maybe. Ezekiel, wherever the river goes, every living creature that swarms will live, and there will be very many fish. It will become fresh. On the banks of both sides of the river, there will grow all kinds of trees for food. Their fruit will be for food, and their leaves for healing. Hosea vividly describes the sins, corruption, and violence human beings are bringing on the earth and the toll this is having, not just on the human community, but all of the species. Contrast this with Ezekiel, who in chapters 40 through 49 describes his vision of New Jerusalem, where the land, the nature, and the wildlife are all in harmony. There's a restored covenant. In the Christian tradition, this text gets picked up, of course, in Revelation 22, describing the tree of life and the new heaven and earth, and we'll talk about that tomorrow, about the leaves of the trees are for the healing of the nations. People will say, oh, that's all the Hebrew Bible. That's all that Genesis stuff. What does Jesus have to do with any of this? I hear this in this country so much. I said, that's a good question. Let's talk about it. As we see in the life of Jesus, animals are playing a pivotal role from the get-go. Matter of fact, the animals are a source of praise, and they reveal the nature of faith, humility, peace, and deeper insight into the kingdom of God. Matter of fact, from birth, all three synoptic gospels place Jesus living and dwelling among the animals. As Luke 2:7 reminds us, Jesus is born in a stable and sleeps in a feeding trough, as both a sign of humility and connectedness with all of God's creation. Jesus is born among the animals and restores the powerful image of the divine being, not only with humanity, but with all creation. John's gospel, of course, starts differently, but still makes a deep theological reference to animals, saying, and I quote, "Here is the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world." All four gospels start with this reference to the animals. Jesus starts his ministry by going out into the wilderness and living and staying among the wild beasts who do him no harm. But we know from the story that the real challenges come when Jesus is faced with the temptation of power, glory, and material comforts of civilization. Statements like foxes have holes and birds have nests, Jesus talks about, and using animals to teach his point and talk about his own itinerant ministry. As we see from this Matthew text, Jesus calls us to learn from the animals as the birds become a model for trusting in God's providence and provision. Like the quotes that we see from Job and Brophy, Jesus' respect for the animals and God's creation calls us to appreciate them as a source of teaching and understanding. At the very end of his ministry, Jesus enters Jerusalem on a donkey. He shares a Passover meal with his disciples, and the Gospels lift him up as the Lamb of God, giving up his own body for the redemption of creation. Here's what's really interesting with the animals. When Jesus becomes the sacrifice, who does not get sacrificed? What are they selling in the temple? The animals. Jesus supplants them and replaces them as the sacrifice. Hebrews 10 talks about that. We don't ever talk about that though, right? Jesus steps in for all of creation, and we think that his salvation is just for us, but what about those animals? Right? Jesus calls us towards compassion and understanding these animals with wisdom and understanding and reliance on the Creator. People ask me, why are you a conservationist? If you're a minister, why are you doing all that you're doing? And I, of course, could talk about those Genesis texts and responsible stewardship of creation. But I prayerfully meditated a lot on this question. Why am I doing what I'm doing? And it's because the greatest commandments we have is to love God and to love our neighbor. How can I say I love God with my whole heart, my whole mind, and my whole soul, and destroy God's amazing creation? How can I say I love God with my whole heart, my whole mind, and my whole soul, and disrespect the very gift that God has given us? Be an irresponsible tenant of God's property and just hand it back destroyed? How can I say I love my neighbor when behaviors towards God's creation and the earth put my neighbor in harm's way? I impact their food security. I impact their ability to feed their family, to have clean air, to have clean water, to have good land for them and their family to live on. Is that loving my neighbor? St. Francis talks about this. If you have people who will exclude any of God's creatures from the shelter of compassion and pity, you will have people who will deal likewise with their fellow humanity. Right? We're seeing that big time, aren't we? Francis knew what he was talking about. He was watching what was going on in the world. So, what's the good news? What's the gospel here? I don't want to depress you all. I'm just giving you the state of what is real and what's truthful. We still believe in facts and science here. The good news, people still deeply, deeply care about wildlife. These numbers show that there's a tremendous amount of unity and bipartisanship opportunities for bold legislation around wildlife. In a heavily divided country, there have been major successes on these issues, and we'll talk about them. But look at this. I mean, 85% of Western voters say loss of wildlife habitat is a serious problem. Look at all these different numbers. I mean, these are rare numbers in our country today. And yet wildlife still unites all Americans across very broad lines in really impressive ways. So let's talk about some of the successes. One of the things that I'm actually most proud of, and I was a part of, was this New Mexico Wildlife Corridors Act of 2019. Why I'm proud of it is it did not stop at our state's borders, but now has been replicated by 32 other states. We're leading the nation on this issue. And this is the first bill which is now mirrored in all of these different places. And basically what it is it says wildlife corridors are areas where large mammals move across a landscape, either seasonally or in their natural habitat. Why are they important? Because corridors help maintain vital populations, genetic diversity, and resilience for climate change. This act creates a policy framework to help animals like elk, deer, bighorn sheep, pronghorn, cougar, bear move across landscapes. It looks at how a landscape gets fragmented through roads, fences, and development, and hotspots where wildlife and vehicle collisions occur. In New Mexico, there's over 1,200 wildlife crashes annually, and it costs $20 million. This says nothing of the countless lives that are lost on both the wildlife and human side. These are hotspots. This is New Mexico Department of Transportation maps showing you where these vehicle collisions occur. Look at all these roads, but then there's very few of these areas where these big problems are happening. If you can pinpoint them and figure out the solutions, you're going to have a whole lot more savings of money. Auto insurance industry is going to love it, and you're going to have people that potentially will have their lives saved because of this issue. The act calls for cooperation between the New Mexico Wildlife Department, the Department of Transportation, tribes, and federal agencies to deal with animal movement. Faith leaders were leading the charge on this bill, and it was successfully passed. And in 2023, we got dedicated funding from the state legislature to create wildlife crossings and underpasses and overpasses in various roads. Here's the really cool thing about wildlife that I've learned in wildlife corridors. Animals need big habitats to move. We have a cougar in New Mexico. His name is Broke Leg. He was hit on 550, which is actually kind of this road going up to Farmington from Cuba, New Mexico. He's about 180 pounds, and he survived the crash. They collared him. That's how they know that he survived the crash. They had a collar on him. And this animal has about a 150-mile range that he is moving around in. And in 1 week's time, he killed a wild horse, a coyote, a badger, an elk, and a mule deer in 1 week. And so they have this collaring data, and they can see where the animal goes, and they see where it stops, and they go find all these skeletons and remains as it caches those other animals in there. This is an impressive species, but look at the size of that range, right? I mean, it is moving from here all the way over to here in a circle and hunting all along the way and storing things. But what's really interesting to me is you can't just have an overpass or an underpass. You got to know what species you're dealing with. So some species like to go over the overpasses. Some species like to go under the underpasses. And if you're putting one in the wrong area, they're not going to use it. And they're going to be like, stupid humans, you don't learn from me. Why would an animal like to go under an underpass or an overpass? What would make the difference there? What's that? It's predators, yeah. And also its senses. So if you look at a pronghorn antelope, ever seen their eyes? They kind of go, and they can almost see right behind them, right? And anyone who's ever hunted pronghorn knows you've got to be very stealthy, and they can spot you from miles away, and if they bust you, they're out of there, and they're going to use their speed to run, right? What about a mule deer? Ever seen what a mule deer looks like? Giant ears. What's their main sense? So a pronghorn is going to want to see when it's crossing something, isn't it? Much more prefers an overpass. A mule deer cares less about seeing things, but certainly wants to hear them, might use an underpass. So you've got to know what the species are doing and what their senses are to develop this and to be successful. You put an overpass trying to deal with a bunch of mule deer, they're going to say, I can't necessarily hear in this wide open space. And if you think about where mule deer live versus pronghorn, it's very different in some of the habitat because they use their senses. On the federal level, we've also been successful. And this is what's fascinating because a lot of people say it's just doomsday up there, but there's some really good stuff that's actually still happening. So there was a Department of Interior secretarial order under the first Trump administration known as 3362, which is to improve habitat quality in Western big game corridors. And is actually working to kind of deal with Department of Transportation and also wildlife winter range in particular and look at all these issues. And this secretarial order is still intact and there's a lot of work still being done on it. Also forest plans built in a lot of wildlife corridors and connectivity. And each of your forests has a specific forest plan. And that was part of the 2012 planning rule is to look at wildlife corridors and connectivity and how animals move on the landscape. And so lots of those forest plans that are now in place still have provisions that are dealing with special management areas for wildlife corridors and connectivity. We worked on 5 big ones that were crossing state lines between New Mexico and Colorado along the Rio Grande, which is one of the main wildlife corridors in this country. And how do you get cross-jurisdictional collaboration to not only happen within the Forest Service, but across state lines and in districts and with different superintendents and supervisors? It was a lot of work. And then of course you've got tribal lands and you've got state lands intersecting that and getting everybody to work together. Because again, as Brophy said, the animals know no borders. They know good habitat, they know healthy range, but they do not care about whether they're in Colorado or New Mexico. We got a moose that keeps coming down from Colorado that they have to keep bringing back up there from New Mexico that just loves to come all the way down to Santa Fe, apparently. It's a beautiful place to visit. We're also working on this on the tribal corridors issue. So you can see tribes have over 140 million acres of tribal lands in the United States. You have to work with tribes in this country if you're going to be successful on these issues. You have to help them have the resources, the management, the technical skills, the planning, the implementation, but you also have to rely on them for their traditional ecological knowledge. Some of their game departments, especially like Santa Ana Pueblo in New Mexico, is more sophisticated than even the New Mexico Department of Wildlife, right? They've got collaring data and all kinds of GPS and GIS kind of stuff going on with their animals and with their habitat. And so you're working collaboratively with the tribes, but also providing resources. And so this bill is on a federal level and is dealing with the tribal wildlife corridors and connectivity, because again, you're not going to say, well, the public land is in really healthy habitat. And the minute they approach the tribal land, there's a lot of problems and invasive species and other issues, right? They are going to move between all these ranges and you've got to see it as an interconnected landscape and ecosystem. I love this quote from Senator Udall about the bill. I worked really closely with him. Obviously, the Udall family has a big presence in conservation. Our planet currently faces a mass extinction crisis. Wildlife corridors as effective tools for restoring native species populations are the first step to addressing the crisis. This legislation developed in consultation with tribes is designed to honor the federal trust responsibility to Indian tribes by supporting tribal work to coordinate wildlife management strategies with federal partners across jurisdictional boundaries. We're working on reintroducing this bill this Congress. The challenge is a lot of the bill was reliant on Department of Interior to work with tribes. That is a bit of a tricky situation right now. So that is kind of what we're trying to figure out how to navigate. The bill was previously introduced in the past 2 Congress, really strong language, really good things. How do you deal with kind of what's going on now and how to figure out what this bill could look like under this kind of new paradigm? The other success, this bill was passed into law, is modernizing state wildlife management. So if you think about who manages the majority of wildlife in your state, who is it? It's mostly your state game departments or wildlife departments or however they're called. Ours used to be the New Mexico Department of Game and Fish. This bill changed that. What's the difference between the New Mexico Department of Game and Fish and the New Mexico Department of Wildlife? Yes, the mission of the agency is clarified because now they have jurisdiction over all wildlife, not just things you hunt and fish for, right? Because now you can look at indicator species, you can look at keystone species, you can look at ecosystems and the health of those ecosystems and whether they can adapt to climate change and drought and being more responsible to science driving all that, because what is good for the pollinators may also be good for the elk, may also be good for the trout, right? And so this modernizes this system to say we can't just think about what people are hunting or fishing, which is the majority of money, right? Where do you get your money if you're a state game department? Hunting and fishing licenses. If the only species we ever manage for are the elk and the fish, and all the keystone and indicator fish species start to collapse, are those elk and fish very happy? Not so much. So this changes that. This gives different jurisdiction. It gives more money. And so what it's also doing is it gives $10.5 million for species of greatest conservation concern. And it's working on recovery and education around those species. And it's giving money from a modest increase of hunting and fishing licenses. The cool thing is it also has a social justice component to it. It gives reduced fees for SNAP recipients for hunting and fishing licenses, as well as reduced fees for veterans and for seniors, because they want subsistence living. They want people to understand how to be able to engage in the wildlife and to still survive and feed their families. And so it was a really good blend of a bill that deals with conservation and deals with social justice components in a very poor state. And our state is leading the nation, and other states are starting to follow along with this same kind of thing. On the federal level, Recovering America's Wildlife Act. There's 12,000 species in need of conservation in this United States. Big problem is we have the Endangered Species Act, which is great, but it's the emergency room. We don't have a whole lot of primary care and intervention for until you hit the threatened or endangered list, right? This bill seeks to change that. And as I said, the majority of conservation funding comes from these fees of hunting and fishing licenses. But right now, we're only funding the other species about 5% of what is actually needed. So if you're not an elk or a deer or a trout, they're probably not doing a whole lot to help you in your habitat and your survival. But this bill changes that. And it gives $1.4 billion to states to manage imperiled species, restore habitat, remove invasives, reintroduce native species. And it also gives $98 million to tribes for conservation efforts along these same lines. This bill is bipartisan. Senator Tillis, Senator Heinrich will be reintroducing this bill very shortly, I'm told in the next month or so. What states are you all from? No, Tillis. All right, what about others? Georgia, gonna need your help. Maryland, gonna need your help. Pennsylvania, definitely need your help. Alabama, yes. Who we got from Arkansas? Anyone know Westerman? We need help in all of these states. And this is where I want to work with you all. I want to work with you all as faith leaders because your voice is critical. Maybe I'll call you up and say, hey, would you be willing if we help you draft an op-ed to talk about the importance of this stuff, right? Why it's happening, and encourage your elected officials to support these kind of things, to co-sponsor these kind of things, to vote for the Recovering America's Wildlife Act. You all have a pivotal voice of conscience for the community. We are going to need your help on these kind of things. That's exactly what we do with Earth Keepers, right? It's connecting these networks. Who's in what state? Who can talk to so-and-so? Who's kind of the pivotal vote on this committee? Who is holding things up in the Senate Indian Affairs Committee? Who can we get to talk to them, right? That is how we work and we organize. That is why I would love for you to sign up on that list, because when you put your zip code, that gives me the information of who do we have living in Alabama that might be able to talk to so-and-so. Let me call Sam up and see if he'd be willing to put an op-ed in Birmingham about this as a faith leader, and why it's important we protect species, or why it's important we do tribal wildlife corridors in different states. That's where we need your help and your advocacy. And that is where you're going to get bang for your buck to make a difference, right? You all are busy. Many of you are pastors. Many of you are elders. Many of you do lots of different things. My goal as a faith leader is to help you be efficient and effective and be pinpoint precise. We don't need a chainsaw. We need a, I'm blanking on the word. Give me a scalpel. We need a scalpel. So yes, and that's what I want to do and to work with you all, because that is what we're dealing with, right? It is how do you get those pinpoint pressure points in our political system to make a difference in certain areas. And as you all know, one person right now can hang up everything. And that is happening over and over again. So we all have got to come together to work on these kind of things. And I get constantly called like, Andrew, do you know any faith leaders in Arkansas? Andrew, do you know anyone in Pennsylvania or Maine? You know, we need to say how to get Susan Collins on board in Maine. What can you do? Anyone you know up there that can talk about this or meet with her or meet with her staff or go, you know, and my job is to prepare you, to help you understand it. And also better yet, to know the politics of your church and faith community. Because as a pastor myself, when I'm shaking hands on Sunday, I always got the parishioner that says that was a great op-ed, or I don't know if I agree with you in your stance on Los Alamos National Labs, right? And so that is my job, is to understand the politics of your community, understand how your session will react, how your own community will talk to you, and to prepare you for it and to be ready for rebuttal, but also to do it in a pastoral way and to speak truth with love. Those are the critical things that we work on. All right, last piece. Indian Buffalo Management Act. This is a great bill. This thing was literally on the 99.5-yard line last Congress from passing, and it got held up exactly like I just told you. Like, no good reason. It just did. And it's not even that much money. I mean, if you look at $15 million in grants to restore bison and to have some of the science behind it, that is like a rounding error in the federal government budget. But that's what we're talking about, right? And this is a game changer. So we're gonna just watch the short 5-minute video on this, because I think this brings home all of what I just talked about and is also very helpful. And in this video, you're gonna see Jason Baldus, who's my colleague, who's done amazing bison restoration. He works for the National Wildlife Federation. He's a member of the Wind River tribe, and a remarkable human being. And you're gonna see a good bit of Jason in this. Is it ready for sound? Don't use sound, just hit play. It's coming. Those are really big, weird looking cows. You want me to play it again? This is a cool bill. This is, I mean, again, the support for these, like, I don't ever run into people like, I hate wildlife, you know, or there's a ton of support. It crosses party lines. It is just getting the leaders to overcome those vested interests, as that report said, right? And right now we've gotten ourselves into a bad place where it's seen as like industry versus wildlife, and it's not that way. And it shouldn't be that way. That's not how this country is built. It's not how it should be running, but we can go down a very bad path, as Noah's Ark taught us, if we start to get into that kind of mindset. Those vested interests. Whew. I mean, I work with a lot of hunters. A lot of hunters care a lot about wildlife. A lot of hunters care a lot about habitat. You know, he's wearing his RMEF shirt, Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation. Some of the hunters are the greatest conservationists, and some can be challenged, right? It's not a monolithic community. Let me put it that way. I'm a sportsman myself. It is complex, but I would say some of the vested interests are ones that see animals as a impediment. Oh, there's an endangered species in that area. We can't drill. We can't mine in that area. You know, they see animals as a problem. Let me put it to you this way. We have congressional legislation focusing on getting animals off the Endangered Species Act and not being allowed to list them. Sage grouse. It's an amazing bird, and they're you know, incredible breeding grounds, but in a lot of oil and gas country, right? Also at the same time, lesser prairie chicken in New Mexico, also in a lot of oil and gas country, right? And there's been acts and moves to remove them from the Endangered Species Act, to not allow them to be listed, to not allow U.S. Fish and Wildlife to work on those kind of species. And again, this is what I would say is the hubris of us playing God, choosing which species live or die because we have these other vested interests. And we're seeing that with species, right? I mean, it's not a theoretical thing. I mean, there are very tangible species that they are gunning for in areas that are very threatened. And if they, you know, their habitat is destroyed, they will be gone. Sage grouse is a greater example of that, as well as lesser prairie chicken.
Overpopulation of these, like the black bears in Central Florida, they just ask to see black bears.
I know.
And what about, you know,
So one of the big issues that we see in a lot of cases is ecosystems out of balance, right? Although Leopold talked a lot about this, he talked about shooting wolves in the West, right? Seeing the green fire go out of their eyes. Ernest Thompson Seton had a similar conversion experience. Both of them became big conservationists after becoming predator killers. When you start to remove those apex predators out of the system, then you start to have other problems. I was just talking to a group actually out here that has a feral hog problem, but then they're also talking about predator control. And I'm like, you get rid of the predators, then you have the overpopulation of the feral hog, and these things are meant to be in balance, right? But when you start to have one, string of the ecosystem pulled out dramatically, you get a lot of imbalance and you start to create these other problems. And, you can also have invasive species that start to outcompete, right? All kinds of things are going on. So it's the way I kind of, for lack of a better way to explain it, there's not a silver bullet to the wildlife crisis, but there's a lot of silver buckshot. You've got to deal with all of these different issues in multiple ways. You got to deal with the state legislation around wildlife corridors and connectivity. You got to deal with tribes and those issues. You've got to deal with the wildlife departments having the resources to deal with the whole ecosystems and keystone species. And that's the reality, right? Like we live in a world where environmentalism is complex and it's interconnected, but that's what makes it so amazing. And if you just try to say, well, we're only going to deal with this one part, you're not going to deal with the bigger issues going on. Is there no way to do it? Okay. Well, I will send out the link to this video because it is amazing. That's a coffee maker, which may also be metaphorical. It's got the sound blocked here. Anyway, I will send this link out. It's incredible. So this is about bison or buffalo restoration by a tribe that has lost all the buffalo in its area. It's an incredible story. It's short, like 6 minutes. It's highly worth watching, but it speaks to the importance of culture and land and wildlife and the extirpation of species and the overhunting and what happened in the early 1800s to 1900s in this country of removing bison and buffalo off the land, and just this idea of changing entire ecosystems, and that we're still living with this. But what these buffalo mean to this tribe, to this community when they were reintroduced, and it shows all that. And it is an awesome, awesome video. So we will send out that link. I know it's a late night. You all have been hit with a lot of information. Happy to answer a few more questions. Mhm. Right. Yep. 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 Well, it reminds me of the interconnection that Hosea is talking about, right? The suffering of humanity and the interplay between the multiple species, right? That's exactly right. And the other thing is we're a species. We think that none of this applies to us. Sam, if you're on your way to the grocery store and your wife tells you to go pick up a gallon of milk and there's a train that's going through the air and it breaks down, what do you tell your wife on your cell phone? I'm not getting you milk tonight, honey, because I got to turn around. There's a train broken and there's too much traffic and it's all stopped and I can't get to the food. What do you think happens to the animals? Right? There's problems in our systems of transport. They're wanting to travel. They're wanting to move across the landscape. They want to see their children. They want to raise their children in a certain way. They want to have this food versus that food. They're seeking those things. We do the exact same. Well, that's an animal problem, right? There's a big traffic jam and the freeways are all blocked up and you get off on the off ramp and you don't go to where you're going. The problem is the animals, they don't have anywhere else to go back to. And it may be freezing cold in winter and feet of snow in that direction. And they can't get to their winter range anymore. They're stuck. So that's a lot of the work that we do. And one of my colleagues, Jeremy Romero, is amazing. He does a lot of that work around wildlife corridors and connectivity to how do we deal with these fences? How do we deal with wildlife friendly fences? Some fences you want to have is they're trying to push wildlife towards underpasses or overpasses. Other fences, they can't get through and they're stuck or they get caught on them, right? And so we're kind of trying to look at all of that and all these things that cause fragmentation of a habitat and what that means to these animals over time. And the other thing that we're seeing is climate is really critical to all that. So with climate happening and all the effects of climate, you're seeing bigger problems around animals needing bigger landscapes. I'll use New Mexico as an example. There was a big fire by Los Alamos, breaks out. All those animals want to push down into these lower regions and out of those mountains to survive. But if those lower regions get developed and destroyed, they have nowhere to go and they can't be resilient. So that's why you've got to have these bigger intact landscapes that allow for climate resilience and adaptivity, because if those animals are getting pushed out of certain ranges because of drought or fire and they have nowhere to go, then they're dead. They'll lose whole herds, you'll lose all kinds of predators, and whole ecosystems will start to collapse and suffer. So when you're looking at areas of conservation, you're not looking at just, oh, we need to conserve this narrow stretch. We may need to have buffer zones on either side to be resilient in our ecosystems and think more strategically like that. And that's a lot of the work we do, right? Is to create those climate resilient ecosystems and zones where if bigger catastrophes in climate happen, these animals have the ability to move in and out of different zones to be safe. So, yeah, thank you all. No, yeah, I get you, man. Right. And huh. Didn't happen. Oh, geez. Okay. Oh, yeah, no, it's okay. It happens. Get it. I'll send the link.